Welcome, conscious beings, and welcome to Conscious Patterns. Today, we're going to look at one of the most prevalent questions that I see come up on forums and discussions, and that is, can I change my type? Or does my type change? And I think that deserves a really definitive answer, and that's something that we're going to try to do today. So let's look at the conscious patterns and the possibility of changing type. Let's get started. Now, I won't keep you in suspense. The answer to the question is no. However, we're going to try to give real, definitive reasons on why that is the answer. One of the first things that we have to do, though, before we get started, is we have to give a caveat. Now, this will not diminish the reasons and the way that we come to our conclusions for why the answer is no. However, I think this has to be said. Otherwise, it is disingenuous to say such a thing. And so I don't think that you can say the answer is no without leaving the possibility that we don't know everything, right? We are not smarter than Mother Nature. So there has to be this allowance that there is something we're not privy to that we don't understand, and that can happen. And to quote the infamous Ian Malcolm from Jurassic Park.
I'm simply saying that life finds a way.
So we can't say that it's impossible. And I want to give examples of that, of why we have to say that. There is a really interesting story that I saw whenever I was a child, and I still remember this. It was on the TV, and there was a mother who had a highly autistic child, and the child was nonverbal. They didn't speak, and the mother had to quit her job to take care of this child. And she, did things to make ends meet, gave piano lessons in their home, just did whatever she could to take care of the child. And he was like that for his whole life. Now, whenever he was in his late 20s, she was going around the house and she heard something and thought, oh, I left the radio on. And so she goes through the house and goes to the radio, and it's not on. And she follows the music into the living room, where she finds her son sitting at the piano playing Mozart expertly. And we're not just talking about hitting some keys right, we're talking about cadences, pressure, playing like a master, beautifully. Now, we would of course say that's impossible, right? If we were given this scenario, we'd say, okay, so this child who does not seem to be aware of anything outside of himself, does not communicate, would he one day be able to go to sit at the piano with no prior practice and suddenly start playing like a classically trained pianist, right? Would he be able to do that? The answer, of course, we would say no, that's impossible. That's not going to happen. So we do have those instances where things happen. There are cognitive possibilities that we don't see as reasonable, as realistic, but they do happen. So we have to allow for that, right? However, that is not you and I. That is not the average person. That is a 99.999 infinity chance that you are that incredible, miraculous percentile and minority. There is almost no chance that that is you.
So you're telling me there's a chance? Yeah!
So I think we can go ahead, we can set that aside, as that is not the average person. So that leaves the rest of us. So what about the rest of us? What about the ordinary average person changing type or choosing to change their type or changing their type over their life, what are the reasons why that is most likely not the case? So let's get into those. Let's state those. I think it's really important to go into what Carljung said, and obviously it's always a great place to start. So let's look at what he had to say, because he did talk about this in psychological types. And first he was kind of making a case that he believed that type had to do with nature, not nurture. And the reasoning that he gave behind this was that type did not seem to be something that was due to outside influences, to environmental influences, to upbringing. And, he went into this and talked about, type doesn't, if type was related to your outside influences, then we should see clusters of types in certain circumstances, right? So if that was the case, there should be a type difference in with socioeconomic status, right? So if everybody who is born wealthy and has a high Ivy League education, well, those should all be intuitives, or they should all be sensors, but they're not. There are many different types. So it doesn't seem to be related to any kind of socioeconomics or status. Obviously, countries, they have all different types. It doesn't seem to have to do with culture. And even when it comes to the nurture of, say, family, he did make a point to mention this as well, and said there seems to be no causation to the nurture of the family that you were born into. So he makes a point to show that when you have children who were born very close to each other, we should see the same type, right? Because this is as much as you can get as a laboratory setting of raising kids a certain way, because they have the same parents, they have the same socioeconomic status. They, in many cases, especially if they're born close together, they're going to have, the same friend groups. So they're getting instilled with everything in the same way, and yet they're different types. And that seems to come from an inborn nature, their preferences of the cognitive information that they have chosen as important to them. And so they seem to have an innate type. So that, of course, leads us to, okay, well then what about whenever they grow up and they, people change? What about that? What about that environment? And again, Carljung does talk about that as well. So we want to talk about environment, right? And the role that plays in cognitive development, how that can change your cognitive functions and how you use them. And Carljung did talk about this, and did talk about how it can look almost like somebody is changing type. And I want to give a really good example for this. So first of all, just to preface that, what he's saying is that you can have people who get into an environment where their other cognitive functions can really surface. So say that and he talks about that, say, as a introvert who is among friends, right? They're in a very safe place and their extroversion really comes out. And he was saying you can see them in such an extroverted way that you'll wonder if they were ever introverted. Maybe you had that completely wrong. However, whenever they get taken back out of that situation, that they will revert back to their natural state. And that's the point, is that they have a natural state. Just because they change how they can be, or they have a scenario where, that part of themselves really comes out. You can have an introvert who is the life of the party one day, right? That doesn't mean that they're extroverted forever. But there's another scenario that I want to bring up that really shows this, especially for those people who say, but throughout my life, I changed types, right? I'm not talking about one time where I came out of my shell. I changed my type. And so what is happening there? To kind of give an example of what Carljung is talking about, let's say that person that says, I was an INFJ during junior high, high school, I was definitely an INFJ. However, whenever I went to college, I became an ESTP. Now, how things like that happen, how that is felt and described by that person is the scenario changed. And so they had to change how they use their functions because they were put in a different environment. And Carljung talks about those shifts, and he points out that there's two scenarios for that, right? There's the good version of that, which we'll talk about, but there's a bad version of that. And that's when that person is put into that environment and it's kind of against their will, it's against their nature, and they are they become stressed. They are having to use those, maybe it's an inferior, maybe it's an unconscious function. They're having to use functions that they don't normally use, they don't like to use. They are in a fear state when they use them, in a stress state. And he's saying that they will become, very stressed. They'll have moments of psychosis, and that it can become very, very unhealthy for them. So that's the bad version of that, right? And people have experienced that. You've experienced that, where you get into having to use those inferior functions for long periods of time, and you become very stressed and agitated, and you have to get away from that environment to kind of relax that and get time back into your main cognitive function. But there's a healthy version of that. There's a good version of that. And so let's take that scenario of that person who left high school. They go to college, and they are looking for, people for roommates. They need a place to live, and they see an ad, and they go and they get into this apartment with these other people who all happen to be extroverts, right? And these people, it's college, right? So they're living it up. They're having parties. They're having a great time. They have people over all the time. Now, this is outside of that person's natural state. They are an introvert. But you know what? As they get, they're going to have their buddies be like, come on, get out here, join us. But they're in a safe place, right? They're around their friends. They get, kind of taken out of their shell, and they even enjoy themselves. They even have moments, like we said, of being the life of the party. They come to be able to see and go, you know what, this isn't as scary as I thought. I actually kind of enjoy this, and they have great memories, some lifelong friends, and they had a great time. And they become able to see that and to mature into it and go, you know what, this isn't scary. I can handle these situations, and in moments I can even enjoy these situations. Now, what happens, and this is what Carljung was referring to, is that whenever they leave that, so they've graduated college or the year ends, whatever, they leave college, they go and they get a job, and they get their own apartment, and then suddenly they say, and then I became an INFP. I became an introvert. What happened? Well, they got taken out of that environment where they kind of had to use those functions. They had to develop those, and they still have those lessons learned. If they're brought back out into a group of friends that are boisterous and, having a grand time, they're gonna be like, hey, I've done that before. It's not as scary. I can do that. I can manage it. I enjoy that sometimes. So they have grown consciously in those cognitive functions. They've used them more, but left to their own devices, they are going to become more introverted. They're going to prefer that. That's what their preferences are. And so they're left to their own devices. They're not going to be calling all their friends, being like, what do you want to do? They're not going to be doing that. They're going to be back into that state where they have a choice again. People are going to call them up, be like, hey, do you want to go out? No, I had a really long week at work, and it's just been a lot, and because they need to gain their energy again. They need that introverted time. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about people who feel that there were times in their lives where they changed types. They didn't change types, they changed environments. They may have had to use those cognitive functions, but they did not change their type fundamentally. And they will revert back left to their own devices. So your environment, you can change. Your type does not change. You might learn and grow. So you might come out of that and have some skills that you have learned through having to use those cognitive functions that you didn't have before. Which leads me into my next point that I want to make about this. And that next point is maturity, right? Growing older, maturing, becoming more responsible, and having conscious growth. And conscious growth has to deal with kind of your type and their hero's journey. And I'll be making a video about that, talking about the different types and the hero's journey of the different types. But each type has kind of their hero's journey that they go on. And as you get older, you get put into you get more experiences where you learn that that inferior function that you've always disliked and had a hard time. You go through experiences, right? And you learn and fumble your way through getting better with using it. And you learn that, it's not so scary. So maybe the person who was an INTP who struggled in their, teens and mid-20s with FE, they've gone through having to use it now. And as they've gotten older, we hope that just like every type, they've learned to kind of go, okay, you know what, whenever I use that inferior, I don't like it, it's uncomfortable, it's a little stressful, but whenever I use it, it actually makes things a little better for me sometimes. When I finally go and stop running away from it and go use it, it's not as terrible as I usually think it will be. And it actually usually makes my life better when I balance out that dominant function. And that's what everybody does, right? You hope that people have conscious growth. You hope that people mature and they aren't as afraid to use different functions and stop running away from them. And everybody has that throughout their life. And they have that hero's journey that they go on, and it's right around the midlife, right? And then your late 30s, early 40s, that people finally have that moment of their type and go, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm so tired of hitting this brick wall in my life that I want to change. That thing that I was afraid of, that thing that has been causing me so much trouble in my life, I want to actually do that thing. I think it might make my life better. And so to give a couple of examples of that, an example might be, so say for the INFJ, right? The INFJ says, it's so hard putting my thoughts into actions. I have all these ideas and I really have a hard time expressing them and putting them into words and then putting myself in front of people and telling them those thoughts and trying to make them make sense because they feel so difficult to reach down and pull out and explain and show people. But I think I've gotten to the age where, I want to do that. Or maybe it's literal SE and it's, I've always wanted to go skydiving and I've gotten to an age where, I want to go do those things I was afraid of. And I think actually I'll love doing that. I think I'll enjoy life more if I go do those things I was so afraid of, and I'll actually see that, I like those things. And that's the hero's journey that almost every type goes on. Whether it's somebody getting better with their FE and going, I need to improve my relationships and how I talk to people. I need to not be so definitive in my reasoning and allow for, openness with people. And I need to power down the TI. And I think if I do that, my relationships will be better. Or inferior FI, all of those things, the NE DOMs with SI going, I need to get my routines down. I need to be focused more. And I think it'll actually improve my life. Now, there's a reason that I mention this hero's journey, because this is going to bring me to my final point, my final reasoning for why changing type why you don't change type at will, why that is not the case. And that is the hero's journey itself. So the hero's journey, whenever I got into typology, I had another thing that I was really getting into, and that was I decided to go ahead and write these novels that were in my head for 20 years. And I said, you know what, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna finally go and write those novels. And right about that time, I discovered typology. And I started looking at both of those things, right? I started to really deep dive into both of those things at the same time. And I found that they joined together in very specific ways. And like I said, I'm going to go through the hero's journey of different types in later videos, but they were connected. And there was a connection here that whenever I saw it, I said, oh, of course, that makes so much sense, because I really wanted to understand. I'm like, can you change your type? Do you change your type? And our stories are about our bringing out our consciousness and putting it into a story for people to understand. It's about conscious growth. That's what the hero's journey is. It's about conscious growth. It's about getting into a new understanding of reality and growing beyond what you thought you knew or what you were capable of. And the hero's journey is not about what happens, the setting, or anything else. It's about conscious growth and coming to that new, higher state of being. The reason that I bring that up is because our stories are about type. Our stories usually feature one type of person who, and it's that person who was maybe an unfeeling person, and their story is how they became more feeling, how they learned about that, how they suffered. And that's what has to happen in the hero's journey, is that the person suffers so much that they have to look at a new way of thinking, a new belief. And they have to really believe that that is going to help them. And they have to, and a lot of times in the hero's journey, the hero will die physically or metaphysically, and they'll be reborn. And that's what has to happen in many of these cases, is somebody has to come to a new belief system. Why this is so important to Does My Type Change is because if we changed our type all the time, or we changed it at will, right? Said, you know what, I think I'm done being an INFJ, I'm going to be an ESTP. And I could do that, then that's what our stories would be. But you don't go watch a movie where somebody said, oh yeah, it's about this person who just keeps changing their personality. So that's not the story that we see. We see somebody who struggled all their life with not being feeling, who's learning to feel. We see somebody who struggled all their life with being timid, being walked over, who learns to stand up for themselves. Those are people who are going through their hero's journey. And because we don't see this in our stories, people changing type all over the place, I would say that doesn't represent us. That's not the reality. If that was the reality, we would see stories that had that. You would have conversations that mirrored that, right? You'd say, hey, did you hear about Bob? Yeah, he was an INFP last week. He became an ESTP this week. And you're like, oh wow, good for him. Right? But those aren't the conversations we have. That doesn't happen. That's not reality. If it was, we would be having those conversations. You would be having those conversations. You would never be stressed. You would never have a problem. You would never have a disagreement, because you would go, oh, hey, I was having a disagreement with this person and these were their reasons. So I just switched over and became ISTP. And now we just had a really deep logical debate about whether or not that's true, and we came to a conclusion, and now we're done. Now I'm going to turn back into an ENFP. That's not what happens. So because those aren't our stories, those are not reality. And that is the final reasoning that I have. That was like the final conclusion, the final thing that really just finished this train of thought for me, was whenever I found those two things, story and type, and I put them together and saw that the answer is those are not our stories. Our stories are not about changing type. And that's how we know that that is not the reality. That is not the ordinary world. Is there a possibility that somebody somewhere could do that? Sure. I think so. But it's not what the rest of us go through. It's not what the rest of us experience. And so that's my answer. That's how I came to it. And I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found something interesting or helped you out in thinking through what you think of this topic. So share in the comments what you think. I'd be interested to see it. And make sure you like and subscribe and give all the thumb loves and all that other kind of stuff. I really do appreciate it. So thank you very much for joining me. See you in the next one.